Thank you, Gilda. If you didn't get one of these handouts, they are in the back at the entrance. So I'm so happy to be here today. It's an honor to connect with all of you and to talk about a topic that I am just as interested in, like Gilda mentioned. I've been interested in this topic for 20 years. And I'll share a little bit about my study and journey in mindfulness and meditation. And we'll talk a little bit about the brain and health and how to practice. At the end, there'll be a little time for questions as well. So the topic is so broad that I'm happy there's a little time afterwards for questions in case I don't get to what you're looking for today. And I'd like to start with a little experiment. Throughout this presentation, there'll be a few experiential moments, and I'd like to start with one. So for this experiment, everybody needs either something to write with, or your phone or iPad is fine, just a way to take a few notes. So raise your hand if you don't have any way to do that. Or if you need a pen. This is one of the few times where I may say, where you may ever hear in a presentation, please get your phones out. So here's how this experiment works, and this helps me to introduce what mindfulness is and the need for it. And if you're using a pen or pencil, you'll just be able to write on any scratch paper. Even the handout I gave you, there's some open space on there. So here's how the experiment works. I am going to recite a list of words, and I would like you to just listen first. I'll let you know when I'm done. And then I want you to write down as many as you can recall. And I promise I'm not trying to increase your stress with a quiz like that. It's not about challenging or testing your memory. It's just about showing how we perceive. So again, the instructions are very simple. I'd like you to just listen to me recite a list of words. I'll let you know when I'm done. And then either with your pen or pencil on a piece of paper or on your phone or iPad, to write down as many as you can recall. So here we go. Listen first, please. Thread, point, sewing, pin, pain, haystack, eye, sharp, syringe, hurt, thimble, knitting, injection, button. That is all the words. You may now write down as many as you can recall. It's not timed. There's no pressure. I'll just wait till you're done. But don't look at your neighbors. Looks like almost everyone's done. Okay, so this experiment is not about how many words we remember, although if you remembered 7 or more words, congratulations, that means you have a good short-term memory. And you may have heard that we can hold on to about 7 items with our short-term memory. When we use mnemonics, we can increase that. But it's not about how many, it's about which ones. So I invite you to be honest, and please raise your hand if you remembered the word thread. Okay, most people who were here for the experiment remembered thread. Any guesses as to why you got that word? First word. Well, what is special about the first word? In terms of short-term memory, it's like a little box. And if I put thread in there, that word, I've already taken up some space in the box. So this is known as the primacy effect in psychology, which means what happens first makes a big impression upon us, so much so that even things that come later on, even though it's more predominant, we may still interpret that person, that situation, that event based on what happened first. That's why first impressions matter. And in the case of something like addiction, I'm also an addiction counselor. You can see how this takes effect in the mind of a person. Addiction can lead to losing everything in life. Can lose your family, can lose your job, can lose your license, can lose your financial stability, can ultimately lose your life. And still people will be thinking, I just have to get back to the way it was when I was first enjoying the substance. And that is because the very first impression for most adolescents who get introduced to drugs or alcohol is positive. You don't have to pay for it. You usually don't get arrested on the first time. You don't lose everything the first time. You're with friends. You're having fun. Very little consequences. And so that makes such a strong impression on the mind, the primacy effect, that even though so many negative consequences can come later, the brain is still strongly associated with what came first. I have seen in cases throughout my life where people had some very negative consequences happen in the first time. When I was in college, a friend of mine went to a party that got raided by police, and through a series of misunderstandings, he ended up in prison for 2 weeks. And he almost had PTSD around alcohol, which means post-traumatic stress disorder, because it was so strongly associated with his negative experience that even the sight of alcohol gave him flashbacks of being in prison. He escaped the squad car, and the police caught up with him, but he had ditched the handcuffs, so he got charged with a felony. Anyways, raise your hand if you remembered the word button. So much less, but a good amount of people. Any guesses as to why those who remembered button got button? It was the last word. And the last word is part of the effect known as the recency effect. So what happened most recently has some significance, but not nearly as much as the primacy effect, which is why most people have already forgotten the most recent thing I said in that list of words. So it's interesting to see how it works. And this last one is the most important, the most interesting. Please raise your hand if you remembered the word needle, if you got needle. Okay, almost everybody who did the experiment. But needle is not one of the words. So take a moment to let that sink in. And I promise I'm not lying to you. I'm not playing a trick on you. Well, I am playing a trick on you, but I'm not lying to you. So any guesses as to why almost all of us who did the experiment have a memory of something that didn't happen? Yeah.
Word association with.
Exactly. Exactly. I'll recite the list again, and you'll know why the thought of needle entered our consciousness. The list is thread, point, sewing, pin, pain, haystack, eye, sharp, syringe, hurt, thimble, knitting, injection, and button. The association is not all sewing items. It's not all medical items. It's that everything has a relationship to needle. And that's known in psychology as the association bias. It is so strong that our brain makes the shortcut and goes ahead and gives us a memory of something that didn't happen. We could imagine how that would be useful because needle fits in. So to be able to have access to that word, that concept, is really useful. It's a shortcut in the brain. But it's also a type of heuristic. Heuristic means a pattern of deviation from rationality for the sake of patterns. And this is why mindfulness is important, because mindfulness is essentially paying closer attention to reality, closer attention to what is, and mostly in the present moment. So since needle didn't happen, it is significant because we could imagine scenarios in social situations where that actually could create trouble for us. I mean, how many times have you heard or perhaps said, I know for a fact this is what happened. I know for a fact this is what you told me last year. We trust our memories so much. We trust our minds so much. We trust our thoughts. And that experiment is to illustrate how the brain is not a fact-producing machine the way that we feel it is. It's a pattern-producing machine. And mindfulness is a tool for looking beyond patterns and trying to see things as they really are. And so if you are curious about those words to tease your family and friends or experiment with your coworkers, I'll be happy to email you the list. I have contact info in the back of the room for afterwards. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is essentially the quality of awareness. Awareness is different than thoughts. We'll talk more about that, but it's not a type of thinking. Thinking positively is a good thing, but that's not mindfulness. Mindfulness is about paying attention in a particular way. With curiosity, which means to be able to be interested in what's happening. So a lot of times in life, especially when there's emotions involved, we actually want to retreat from reality. And it makes sense historically if there's something dangerous about our circumstances. But even when things are not dangerous, they're simply uncomfortable, we have a strong tendency to avoid. And this manifests in modern life as in a lot of different anxiety disorders and school avoidance. It is the wish to avoid triggers that are not necessarily dangerous, but they are uncomfortable, and it impairs our ability to function in a healthy way. So mindfulness requires an attitude of curiosity. Even if something is uncomfortable and painful, we want to be able to practice being interested in all we can find out about that experience. Another one is openness, which means I'm allowing reality to be as it is. So many times we divide our mind. We're doing one thing but thinking we should or ought to be doing another. Watching TV thinking I should be doing my homework. Doing homework thinking I should just be watching TV. I experienced this throughout my years of trying to establish a routine in meditation. Every time I'd be sitting in meditation in the beginning, I'd be thinking I really ought to be doing my laundry, cleaning the house, catching up on work. And when I'm doing those things, when I'm doing laundry, I'm thinking I really ought to be meditating. So our mind gets divided, and openness is about being willing to fully experience where we are, what we're doing, who we're with, and it's a wonderful way to live. And the final one is flexibility. This is also a part of the attitude or the awareness of mindfulness. Flexibility means that we have the choice to direct our attention in different ways. You can think of your mind like a flashlight. We can't perceive everything all at once. We don't have eyes in the back of our head. We have limitations with the other senses. But if we think of awareness like a flashlight, we can get a lot of information from wherever we direct our attention. And yet, people don't practice that way. They hold their attention or they fix their attention on something, oftentimes something triggering or uncomfortable or unpleasant. People dwell on the past. People ruminate about mistakes that happened in the past. People worry. We're talking a lot about worry today. People worry and obsess over what could happen in the future. And then the flashlight is just planted there. So much so that it seems like that actually is the story of my life. That is everything that I'm experiencing, because that's all I can think about or all I can pay attention to. With flexibility, we just start moving it around, even to seemingly totally ordinary things, like the color of a wall, the color of the floor, the sound of the fan. In mindfulness training, everything becomes something that can be included in one's practice, and nothing is really an impediment. Sometimes when I'm teaching mindfulness meditation, people say, I can't concentrate because the fan is so loud. And I'll say, but that's something that you can pay attention to. That's something that's happening in the present moment. It's again just an idea that things should be other than they are, and that actually is counter to the idea of being present with reality as it is. So those three qualities, openness, curiosity, and flexibility, is mindfulness in a nutshell. But there's two ways to go about cultivating this in life. People can become mindful in the way that they live, and people can become mindful by having a formal practice. Formal practices are things like meditation, martial arts. Martial arts requires that the practitioner tune into what their body is doing in space. And so you become much more grounded in the present moment when you learn martial arts. Yoga is another example. Yoga requires that you pay attention to your breathing and your body in the present moment. And because some of the postures require a lot of attention, it actually pulls people's awareness away from the past and future and grounds it in the present moment. And these techniques have some wonderful benefits. So again, there's two aspects to this. Cultivating it as a way of life informally, like just being a more conscious person, and having a formal practice that we can do on a daily basis, like hygiene, to make this more integrated into our consciousness. And I'd like to share next how this impacts the brain when we do this. So in the handout that you hopefully have, on the back there's an image of the brain. It looks like this. And some fascinating research has been conducted in the last 10 years. So there's just an abundance or an explosion of scientific insight about mindfulness and the brain, and that's why we're talking about it today. That's why we're talking about it in schools, because we now know that there's so much that can, so much potential for benefiting everyone, that we ought to have it available to families and to schools and to teachers and to students. So I highlighted 3 areas that change when people practice this for about 20, 30 minutes a day, for as little as 8 weeks. 8 weeks seems to be a stretch of time that neuroscientists have found results in measurable changes in the brain. Previously, we didn't know that the brain could change. We thought it was pretty static, and that's why you've heard the expression, you can't lose a single brain cell because you never get it back. But we now know, since about 20 years ago, that depending on what a human being pays attention to, that actually grows the brain and changes the structure of the brain in a way that accommodates that behavior or that activity or that type of perception. It's called neuroplasticity, which means the brain is very malleable. And I'll tell you a couple experiments where this was uncovered, because they're really interesting. One is in Italy. In Italy, in studies of violin players that are right-handed. So their left hand moves dexterously across the fretboard. Neuroscientists found that those musicians have larger maps of their left hand in the motor cortex of their brain, which is on the opposite side of the brain. And it is not that they have that quality in the brain, and that's why they're good at playing the violin. Their brains were normal because of days and days of paying attention to the instrument in that way. The brain grew and changed. And by putting people in paradigms where they've never played the violin and they practice every day for 8 weeks, the scientists could observe measurable changes in the motor cortex controlling the hand. So me as a musician, when I've had students in the past and they say, I'm just not wired for this, I say, you're not wired for this yet. With enough time, your brain will get the idea this is something that's important to you, and it will adapt. It's also the case with jugglers. Jugglers have larger occipital lobes, which are the vision center of the brain. And if you teach people to juggle, in 8 weeks, all the regions of the brain involved with detecting visual motion will grow stronger, so that it almost seems like the balls or the pins or whatever being tossed are moving slower than they are, because there's more cortical matter. Cortical matter means the cortex, the top part of the brain. There's more to work with there to slow down this process and facilitate that activity that is important to the person. Cab drivers in London have to memorize every street in the city before they can get certified. And researchers there have found that they have larger hippocampuses, 25% larger than average. This region of the brain helps a person to memorize things. So there's a few fascinating studies that show that the brain is not static. The brain is very malleable, and depending on what we pay attention to, we can self-direct neuroplasticity. We can change our own brains to make us healthier, to facilitate what we want to do in life. And sadly, and not to scare you, but the more we worry, the better our brain gets at worrying. There's actually regions of the brain that differentiate between what is favorable for us and what is harmful. And it's nice to have a balance there. But if we spend more time or a significant amount of our time worrying about what could go wrong, you can actually get better at finding more things that can go wrong. And this is what keeps people up at night and why people have trouble falling asleep, because that's usually the time when people start worrying about all the uncertainties of life. And it becomes effortless because the brain actually adapts to accommodate that. So by practicing positive thinking, people actually can balance this out and grow their ability to see the good that is always there. So I highlighted 3 regions. The first one is called the amygdala. It's not important to remember these parts of the brain. It's just to give more scientific validation to what we're going to be talking about. The amygdala is this almond-shaped structure, the orange highlighted area. It's deep in the brain, and it regulates the fight-flight instinct of a human being. So it's intimately connected to anxiety disorders like school anxiety, social anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which was identified after the Vietnam War. And sadly, to this day, 270,000 Vietnam vets still have full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why this information is so important, so that people can continue to get the help that they need. But when there's an anxiety disorder like this, and in other types of mental illness like depression, major depression, the amygdala expands. It's almost like a swelling or an inflammation, and it's called hypertrophy in medicine. But when people practice mindfulness, the amygdala reduces in size. It has a calming effect, and that translates to more emotional regulation. And there's been some interesting experiments with this, and also case studies throughout American history. For example, there was a serial killer in the 60s, a famous sniper shooter in Texas, that wrote a suicide note saying, I don't know what's wrong with me, and asked for an autopsy after he died, and they found a tumor on his amygdala, pressing against his amygdala, so he couldn't control his behavior. He had these bouts of rage and aggression. His fight-flight instinct was totally out of balance. And so when we practice mindfulness and meditation, this region of the brain actually gets supported and regulated, and people feel like they have a better ability to manage their response to the circumstances in their environment. The second one is the hippocampus. I mentioned the hippocampus. It's involved with memory, but the hippocampus is a part of the limbic system in the brain, which is involved in all kinds of bodily functions, like sleep, digestion, immune functioning. The hippocampus is also part of learning, and this grows and expands just by paying attention to the present moment. The third one is the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is in the front of the head, behind the forehead. This is the executive decision-making center of the brain, and it's the last part of the brain to develop, to come online. And because of this, this region of the brain is the least influenced by genetics. It's more influenced by culture, your environment, your upbringing, because it's happening throughout adolescence, and it doesn't finish until about 25, 26 years old. So this region being involved with seeing the bigger picture means that we need it to be fully developed to really understand the consequences of our actions. So there are limitations for students to be able to do this. So when parents say things like, when you have kids someday, they just roll their eyes because it's hard for them to even conceptualize something like that in the future. And I've also heard it explained as like a new car without the brakes being installed yet. To be a teenager is like that, which means there are limitations to impulse control. But by doing mindfulness activities, this region is supported and it grows, and people can access the most of its bandwidth early on, and it can be very helpful to students. And sadly, after this part of the brain fully develops at 25, 26 years old, then it ordinarily declines. And by the time a person is 50 and beyond, they find that once again, it's kind of challenging to learn new things and to remember things and figure out things, and you have to focus a lot more. And in an experiment at Harvard with meditators in Boston, they imaged their brains and compared it to demographically matched subjects that never did any mindfulness or have no experience with yoga or meditation or anything like that. And they wanted to look at the volumes of gray matter in the cortex of the prefrontal cortex. And they found what they expected in the non-meditators, that after 25 years old, between 25 and 50, when they plotted all the data, there's a natural decline. Oh, this way for you. But in the people who had a mindfulness practice, it was consistent across 25 years, from 25 to 50. There was no age-related cortical decline. And now we know that practicing these techniques actually preserves the integrity of the brain, and it translates to a longer life. Researchers are thinking maybe 5 or 6 years if you practice like 20, 30 minutes a day for a considerable amount of one's life. And there are explanations for this on the cellular level. Inside of the human cell, protecting the DNA is a cap called a telomere. A telomere is something like a shoelace at the end of the lace on a shoe. It's like a plastic cap in that case, and that protects the lace from unraveling. Similarly, at the end of strands of DNA, there are caps, and they protect our DNA and hold it together. And just as a shoelace eventually deteriorates and the laces fray, the DNA frays, and that translates to age-related disease. And these telomeres shorten over time across our life. And they were discovered in the 70s by a molecular biologist named Elizabeth Blackburn, who won a Nobel Prize for her work on telomeres in medicine. And it's been thought that they only shrink. And we've found that most stressors in life, like war, poverty, and so on, actually advances the shrinking of these caps. And nowadays, you can actually send a cheek swab of cells to a laboratory, and you can get your molecular age. And scientists have found that this is actually the strongest predictor of how long you'll live, the most accurate predictor of human life. Because once these caps shorten enough, there will be nothing a person can do to protect themselves from age-related diseases. Cancer, all types of degenerative conditions. But beautifully, we have found that through meditation and mindfulness, the telomeres actually grow back. They don't just go in one direction. If a person has a practice like this and a positive attitude, telomeres can repair and our cells can rejuvenate to some extent. And it's achieved through an enzyme called telomerase. So by practicing the techniques we'll talk about today and this way of life, the brain produces more of an enzyme. It's a nucleic protein that goes inside of the cells, and it enhances the integrity of the caps on the DNA. So that's a little bit about brain and biology and why this is important. I want to talk about just 3 qualities to improve this in your life and to pass this on to your families and to your children. And we'll do another technique at the end, a mindfulness meditation. Very simple to do. Anyone can do it, and you can do it anywhere. And then if there's questions, I'll be happy to take some questions. The 3 qualities are intention, non-judgment, and acceptance. Intention means to give more awareness to the present moment. We now know that human beings spend at least 50% of their day lost in thought. At least 50% of the day, which means you're thinking about something in the past or future and you don't know that you are. Someone asked you something, you would have to snap out of your daydream. We do this while driving, we do this while eating, we do this while even conversing with friends on the phone. And we're so used to it because it's so easy to do. And we have the capacity to do it for a reason. It conserves energy. To constantly be focused on everything you're doing all the time actually can drain the battery a bit. So there are deeper parts of the brain that can do things like hygiene, brushing your teeth, tying your shoes, driving your car, and you don't have to consciously think about it. And this is the experience of looking back and saying to ourselves, I don't know how I got onto this street. I don't remember if I washed my hair this morning. So I go to the shampoo bottle and I try to see if there's some evidence. Maybe it's still open because I don't want to do it twice. But I was daydreaming. So this happens to most human beings. And it's a problem only because we're more likely to make mistakes and we don't get to enjoy life as much. There's no happiness for us in the past and future, only a superficial kind when we're thinking of something pleasing. But ultimately, you have to come back to the reality that that's not your current experience. And when we're thinking about something negative, that also has a negative impact as well. So for the sake of getting more joy out of life and being more effective at what we do, we ought to be more intentional. Intention also involves purposeful living, to think about what kind of person do I want to be? What values do I want to honor in life? And this may sound obvious, but it's not obvious because as I talk to people over 20 years and get to know people, in the hospital especially, I ask them to pick some core values. And they have a hard time with this because they think, I have lots of values. I'm respectful, I'm kind, I'm honest, and so on. And I explain to them, but you can't be all of those things all of the time. I can't be in a family and honoring the responsibility and loyalty to a family while at the same time being as independent, as free as I can in my life. And as adventurous and as spontaneous as one could live in a human life. You can't do both at the same time. So you have to make choices. And when people don't know which of the two is more important, what do? They do whatever's offered first. Or they do what people think they're supposed to do. Or what their parents said you should do. Or what society is honoring in terms of values. And that's what so many people are doing. Our society, our cultural values are things like youthfulness, sexuality, beauty, and so on. And so it infiltrates the consciousness of all the people. And everybody is racing around trying to achieve those things. And materialism, of course. But that's not the same in every culture. And certainly it can't be the case for the authentic things that the individual cares about. And you won't know this unless you actually take an inventory with oneself. And only then can somebody truly be intentional and authentic. Without it, we don't know. And it's only necessary to do this because of two things. There's limited time. If our lives were much longer, we wouldn't need to prioritize values. You could be carefree for 100 years, and then you could be committed for 100 years, and so on. You could make money, and then you could, live as a vagabond. We could have all different experiences, but we don't have that. We have limited time. And then secondly, we have high distractibility, especially in this modern world with technology, with phones, with social media. There is an arms race in the world for attention. There's a reason why social media is free. We enjoy this as a service. We just get on our Facebook, we can get an Instagram, we can get all these different accounts, and we don't have to pay anything. And there's a reason for that. Because we are not the customers. The social media users are not the customers. The social media users are the product. The advertisers are the customers. That's why it's free. And I don't think people fully realize that or fully appreciate that. That's not to say these things are bad or wrong. It's just to say that there is a competition for attention. That is what's being sold. I can give you 5 hours a day of Todd's attention. What is that worth to you? And there's, 100 million Todds giving that much attention. There's a lot of money to be made there. And so when everything is competing for attention, it's certainly plausible that we could get distracted. There are new apps now, and I think it would be interesting to use some of these in your families. And I think it's built into new iPhones now. One is called Moment, I think. And it has a metric called time well spent. Because when people look back and they find out how many hours they actually spent, like on Facebook or scrolling through a news feed, they don't always feel that that is what they intended to do. To find out you spend 45 minutes on average on a particular app before you sit up in the morning probably wouldn't fall in line with what somebody would say is my intentional morning routine. So the point here is to realize that we actually don't live the way we think we want to, because we're constantly being distracted by other influences. And to have an authentic life requires that a person becomes aware of some of those factors and uses resources to transcend that. And I mentioned earlier that we get really good at worrying. Worry is wired into our system from our ancestors through evolution, because worry was probably one of the most valuable qualities a human being could have to survive. And so it was chosen through natural selection. Just imagine 100,000 years ago, me and another hunter-gatherer looking for a place to stay for the night, because homes are still relatively new in the grand scheme of human history. And during this nomadic period, people had to move from place to place looking for food. And let's say we come to a cave. And the other fellow was like, great, there is a place for us to stay. Let's go. And I'm like, wait a minute. We don't know what's in there. Could be a wild animal in there. And he looks over to me and says, hey, don't be so negative. Think positively, man. And so I'm like, oh, you think positively. And he runs in there and he gets eaten by a predator or a tiger or something. And that kind of person gets weeded out. And I'm the ancestor then. So inheriting from generation to generation, passing on a brain that's hardwired to do that, to worry, to think about what could go wrong with every situation. How could this interview fail? It's a good opportunity, but they probably won't like me. It's a great relationship that could be starting here, a great friendship, but they're probably not going to like me. Our mind will just spontaneously do that because it had to do that in the past, and that's programmed into our DNA because it was life or death in the past. Now it's not. The world is actually much safer, even though it doesn't seem like that, much safer than it was in other time periods. Now we're triggered by things that are uncomfortable but not dangerous because of the legacy of worry. And so you have to really be intentional with positive thinking and an open mind, an open attitude to overcome this. People cannot, I have found, and including myself, who people tell me you're the most optimistic person I know, but it doesn't come naturally to me. What comes naturally to me is to think it's probably not going to work out. So we have to practice it. And positivity is not natural, so people think that they can casually have a positive attitude or that they're just a positive person. There are just limitations to this. But the present moment always has a greater influence on the brain, and it doesn't take very long. Imagine if it took as many years as we've been doing something wrong to do it right. We can change our brain in 8 weeks. And the simplest way to do this with intention is through gratitude. Gratitude practice, and if you can help your students and your children to make gratitude journals, all it requires is that you write 3 experiences that happened in the course of your day. What was special about it? Why was it positive? How did it help you? This is different than gratitude lists. Gratitude lists have been shown to not really do much for people because I can list a whole bunch of things and actually feel nothing for it. But I can't just put my family, I can't feel nothing if I think of an experience with my family. Like if I wrote, my child drew me a picture today and it says, I love you, I'm going to feel something. If I just write kids, I don't have to feel anything. And that's why it has to be kept to a 24-hour window. Because when you string these together, you change the brain. The brain starts to see something good is happening all the time, every day. And that will actually be a revolution for human beings. Because it's never been like that. And deep within our DNA, we don't believe the world is that way. And so we can always see trouble, we can always see conflict, we can find it, we can manifest it. And drama finds us wherever we go. And we overreact to things that are not dangerous at all. You know, occasionally road rage involves something really dangerous, but most times it doesn't. And I think it has something to do with having a 4,000-pound box around you. If you were just walking and somebody brushed against you or cut you off, we probably wouldn't have the same reaction. It's the same with social media. We're hiding behind a screen and thousands of feet of distance between us and the next user. And so negativity has some of these protected places, but we have to practice this. And then the next one is non-judgment. Non-judgment is about not assigning a label to yourself, like ugly, stupid, I'm an idiot, or to others, this driver's a moron, or to circumstances and your life situation. So I may wake up and there's no hot water, and I overslept, and I get on the road and I get a flat tire, and most human minds are going to link those three things and determine today's going to suck. That's a judgment. That's not a fact. And those three things are probably not as related as we think they are. We draw cognitive threads through negative experiences because we're so good at worrying. And then it kind of colors the rest of our experience through an effect known as the confirmation bias. Confirmation bias states that whatever I believe, I look for evidence to reinforce that belief. This is obvious with religion and politics. People tend to associate and introduce the ideas that reinforce or support what their previous existing beliefs are. But what about when I believe that my life will never be good, that I'll never be a good student, that I'll never be able to have a loving partner or a healthy relationship? Well, then the confirmation bias is going to direct a person to look for evidence to reinforce that. And the evidence can be, well, I already had 3 relationships that didn't work out, so I must be unlovable. And that's how non-judgment takes root and becomes a habit. And even after you hear what I'm talking about and you think, that sounds pretty good, I do need to work on that, it won't just change because I don't want to judge. The next step will be to notice how judgment happens so spontaneously and to react to that less. And then after that, the judgment may not come. So don't get discouraged when you think, I would like to be less judgmental of myself and others, but you still find yourself judging. That is actually a step in mindfulness, to be aware of what your mind is doing. What you will find in this practice is that it's probably more accurate to say that thoughts are something that happen to us rather than something that we do. If it's something that we do, wouldn't we be able to just stop doing it? And it turns out nobody can stop thinking very easily. So if I can't stop thinking, how is it something that I am authoring? I think it's more accurate, and science seems to be supporting this, that it's more accurate to say that thoughts are actually something that are happening to you. But because it has such the character of you, we then interpret it as my thoughts, how I think. But in the case of depression and anxiety and PTSD, you can clearly see people are afflicted by the thoughts. They're suffering from the thoughts. In the case of addiction, people come to us every day saying, how can I get free from these obsessions and cravings? That doesn't sound like something people are choosing to do. And the brain science reinforces that understanding, that no, you can pinpoint on the map, on a neural image, look, the decision-making faculty is offline through whatever types of substance use, it's now not working. And maybe once upon a time there was more choice involved, but it's not there now. And when you realize this, it gives people a sense of freedom. Like, thoughts can come, they may not be helpful to me, and I can let them go through non-judgment. I don't have to judge myself for judging. That's what happens to people, especially with anxiety. Let's say you have to go for a test. Something is unusual in your lab report. Now you got to get a test. And automatically you start worrying about it. And then when you start worrying about it, you judge yourself because you know that's not good for my health if I worry and I don't sleep tonight. And then you judge yourself for being worried about that. And so it becomes this vicious cycle. So the simple mantra here is just don't believe everything you think. You thought there was a needle at the beginning of this, and there's no needle. So we don't have to believe everything we think. Loosening our grip on our conviction about I'm always right with whatever I think, even about myself, that I'm no good, or this person's no good. If we just simply loosen the grip, the thoughts can come, and they can just be more like weather patterns. It comes and goes, but that's not really me. We would, with our mindfulness and with our conscious awareness, we can feel more like the sky, and the thoughts, the moods, the energies that pass through us are the weather. So it can give you a sense of detachment. I'll tell you a short story to illustrate this. This is a Chinese story about a wise farmer who had a son and a horse. The horse was a large horse, very powerful horse, and his friends would often compliment him on how magnificent his horse was. And he would say, he had this wise expression, what seems like a blessing may be a curse. And one day the horse escaped the farm and was gone for weeks. And the other neighbors in the village came to console the farmer, saying, we're really sorry about your loss. That really was a great horse. And the farmer turned this expression around. What seems like a curse may be a blessing, he says to them. And then this horse returns spontaneously with 20 other wild horses, and the farmer becomes wealthier with horses. And so the people are amazed. And they say, you were right. It really turned out to be a good thing. And he said, but what seems like a blessing may be a curse. And when his son is trying to train and tame one of the wild horses, it kicks him and breaks his leg. And now the farmer's saying, what looks like a curse may be a blessing. And the final part of the story is that this part of China is engaged in a war, and there's a draft of all the young men in that village, and they all die in that war, except for the farmer's son, because of his broken leg. And the moral of the story is simply that we don't know what anything means, truly speaking, because every event is intimately tied to every other event before and after, all the way back to the Big Bang. So to extrapolate, which means to remove one experience from your life and set it on the table of your mind, the judgmental table of your mind, and say, this really sucks, now my life can never be good, is limited. It's short-sighted. It's like taking a sentence out of a book and deciding that this book can't be good. We know that if you put it back into the context of the whole, it may be right where it needs to be. So the point here is to simply get better at letting life unfold. Since everything is intimately connected, I can't pull my experiences out of my life to determine the quality of my life any more than I can take a note out of a song and still have the song. The song has to flow to even be a song. Once you just play a note, you don't have the song anymore. So non-judgment requires a little bit of practice, but in the beginning you'll just simply notice it as a habit. After noticing for some time and not following through on that, not feeding that as much as we used to, then it stops to come as often because the brain starts to learn it's not as useful as it used to be. So let's do a little experiment with these first two. Intention and non-judgment. Intention means being purposeful in the present moment, and non-judgment means not assigning a label to yourself or to others. So I'd like you to set your things down for a moment. And we're going to stare at our hand for 3 minutes. Now, before we begin this exercise, I'd like to ask you, what kind of judgments have you made about staring at your hand for 3 minutes? Anybody think, I can't do that? That'll be too boring. That sounds stupid or whatever. So probably, now I'm inviting you to just not believe that for a moment. Don't believe everything you think. And here's how we're going to do it. I will guide you in how to pay attention to your hand. We're going to use our right hand, and I want you to keep in mind this intention and non-judgment. So to do it means if I get distracted and I start thinking about something else, I want to bring my awareness back to wherever Todd is guiding us to pay attention. It's okay if I get distracted, but when you catch it, come back. That'll make you more intentional. And when you're looking at your hand, to let go of judgment requires that you don't compare. So when the thoughts come, this is a short finger, long finger, it's too dry, it's too wrinkly or whatever, that's all in comparison to hands. So let's imagine we've never looked at a hand before. So we don't know what it's supposed to look like. And this is a quality of mindfulness in Zen known as beginner's mind. Zen mind is a beginner's mind. They try to practice, Zen Buddhist monks try to practice doing everything as if it's the first time they ever did it. To look at snow, not as if it's something we got to deal with year after year, as if they've never seen snow before. And I once read an account of a 100-year-old man who lived in Vermont. His book's called Loving and Leaving the Good Life, and it's about the end of his life. And he described the last time he looked at snow because he knew he was dying. And he had dealt with it. It had caused so much trouble for him on the farm there. But when he knew it was the last time, it was just like the first time. It's just like a child seeing it for the first time. Anyways, that's how we're going to look at our hand. So if we've never seen a hand before, the judgments may come, but we're not going to follow them. We'll try to stay in the present moment. So take your right hand with the back of it facing you, place it in your left hand. Doesn't matter how far or close it is from your eyes, but we're going to be looking at the back of our hand. And I want you to first look at the back of your thumb. We're going to start by looking a little more closely at the fingernail. Again, try to do this as if you've never looked at your hand before. So just look for facts. What color is there? What shape is there? What texture is there? And then come down the thumb, and I want you to look at the back of the thumb. Of course, there are lines, and again, there are colors. But see if you can notice things that you've never looked at before. There are deeper lines, and there are shallower lines. They're curved, kind of look like ripples in a pond. And then we're going to do this with the index finger. Look at the back of the index finger, looking for facts, colors, shapes, texture. Look at the back of that finger. Notice the lines and colors on the back of your index finger. And then come to the middle finger, same thing. Looking at the fingernail, I see red, purple, pink, the white at the base. Coming down, noticing how there's faint lines and then there's deeper lines around the joint. And then we'll do that with the ring finger, starting at the fingernail. For some reason on this one, I don't have a white base. Then the pinky. And then the back of your hand at the base, I want you to look for all the different colors you can find in the back of your hand without judgment. If you look carefully, you'll see veins. So there may be blue, there may be purple, there may be red, different shades of skin color. And then flip your hand over. We're going to look inside our hand now, starting with the pinky. I want you to look at the fingertip of the pinky. Look carefully and notice the grooves of the fingertip. As you look into those grooves, you may find some other lines that are very subtle that you may have never noticed before towards the side of the fingertip. Look at how the pinky is divided into 3 sections. And notice how the color of the bottom 2 sections is very different than the fingertip. And then come over to the ring finger and take a look at that fingerprint. And then the middle finger, fingerprint, the tip, and then look at the other 2 sections. Try to notice lines that you've never seen before, colors that you've never looked at before. And then the index finger. Take a close look at that fingerprint. And then when you come over to the thumb, you'll notice that the thumb only has 2 sections. The other fingers all have 3. And when you look deep at the fingerprint of the thumb and see those grooves, it either looks like a vinyl record or a hurricane pattern. Coming down the thumb, where the thumb meets the palm, you will see countless lines fanning out into the palm. Now look into the palm and try to, once again, notice all the different colors that are there. And then look at the lines. There are deep lines that cut across the palm of the hand, and then there are many, many subtle lines that you may have never seen in your life. Then I want you to make a fist with the thumb side facing you, like this, like you're holding a microphone. I want you to look into the side of your index finger there, and you'll notice a couple lines. In my travels in Asia, some people say that those lines mean something in different cultures. If it means how many children you're going to have, I have a lot of work to do. And then you can relax your hand, and you can pick up your things again if you want to write. But how did that feel? Was it as hard as you thought it was going to be to stare at your hand? We did stare at our hand, but we didn't stare at our hand for 3 minutes. We stared at our hand for about 7 minutes. So if I had said I didn't intend to do that, but we took a little longer than I hoped. But if I said that we were going to stare at our hand for 7 minutes, then people really would have judged it, right? So this is the power of mindfulness in the present moment. We can just see things as they are, and it leads to grounding. So you'll learn about grounding techniques when you research more about mindfulness. And we teach a lot of grounding techniques to students, to teenagers in our adolescent programs in the hospital. One similar technique like this, we won't practice it, I'll just explain what it is, and you can practice and share it with others. It's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's just using each of the 5 senses in a systematic way. So you would look at 5 things in the room that you are, or wherever you find yourself in nature. You pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you just look at each one carefully for a moment. Then you go on to 4 things to listen to. Maybe there's a bird, maybe there's some wind, maybe there's some leaves rustling, maybe somebody's walking, somebody's talking in the distance. You just notice each one without judgment. And then you feel 3 things. You can feel the air, you can feel your clothes, you can feel your hair. Then you smell 2 things in the air. What smells can I identify? And then lastly, you taste 1 thing. It could even be a sip of water. And by the time the practitioner gets through that, they're very grounded. Because when you are unmindful, which means distracted and thinking about the past or the future, the senses don't work very well. That's why we don't know how we got onto a particular road, even though our eyes were seen. Our eyes were seen, but our mind wasn't with the eyes to really take in the experience. So then we don't really get grounded. If you want to ground, the simplest way is to just take these 5 senses and know they can't work fully unless my mind is in the here and now. It's a simple path to the present moment. So that's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the last technique, or the last quality, is called acceptance, which comes from a Latin word, which means ad capere. Ad capere in Latin meant to receive. And when we talk about acceptance in mindfulness training, people usually bring it up when people need to work on forgiveness and letting go. But its original meaning meant to receive. So the way this applies to mindfulness is to think of a wave in the ocean, which has 2 key points, the 2 access points, the beginning of the wave and the end of the wave. And when we apply this to emotional life, you will have waves of emotion. On a daily basis, emotions are constantly arising and falling. But we do 2 things that become unmindful with this wave at those 2 points. We block feelings from starting. We don't want to feel stuff. So what do? We distract ourselves from the present moment. And in more harmful situations, People self-harm. People abuse substances. People binge television and isolate and so on, or oversleep, so they don't have to feel whatever they're feeling. I had an experience recently with a young patient in the hospital, and she was telling about how she was going to be at an event where her ex-boyfriend was going to be there, and it was still stressful for her, she was saying, even though they broke up over a year ago. And then she started to cry a little bit, and she chastised herself for that, and she said, but it's stupid for me to feel this way. I can't cry. I need to be over this. I shouldn't even be feeling anything. And I asked her, well, what's wrong with feeling something? She said, because I shouldn't. I should be over this, which is, not accepting whatever is. And I said, but if there's actually sadness there, why not experience it? Why not explore it? Let's see what it is trying to tell us. And she's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm like, just be sad. So she just allowed herself to be sad for a little bit and started crying. And then the tears stopped, and she chuckled. And I asked, why are you laughing? She's like, because I'm not sad anymore. I just kept blocking it, and it just kept building up. And I said, the sadness just means that person really was somebody important at a time in your life. It doesn't matter that a year has passed. There's no formula for when you don't get emotions anymore. But by stuffing it and beating yourself up over it and not accepting that it's there, it's like a landfill in your heart. And to experience it, to be able to allow it to come through us, is like composting waste instead of throwing it in a landfill. Now, composting requires that we work it a little bit, we process it a little bit, and in the case of food waste, it gets introduced and reintegrated in the soil, but from there, you can do anything. You can grow flowers, and in the landfill, it just grows and grows, and it smells bad, and nobody wants to go near it. And that's what it's like with emotions. So that's the front end. On the back end, the emotion has risen and revealed itself fully, and people don't let it go. Prime example is guilt. Guilt has swelled up in a person. They realize they made a mistake. They know what they would do differently, and it's finished. But it's not finished because they keep resurrecting the guilt to somehow punish themselves to try to make it balanced. And yet, there's nothing left for guilt to show you about what to do differently. It's achieved its purpose. And so emotions can only stick around by resurrecting them in our thoughts. Emotions are like weather patterns. They're just going to go. But we either block it or we hold on to it, and they can't just flow through us and be types of energy that we experience. We don't have to be so identified with it. And so that's what acceptance is in totality. Allowing experiences to arise in consciousness and allow them to go when they have fulfilled their cycle. And a good analogy for this, especially the letting go part, I learned when I was studying yoga and meditation in India. I found that people trapped monkeys with a jar that had peanuts in it, and they would put this jar like sealed on a branch in a tree, and when nobody's around, the monkey will come and it'll grab the nuts, and then its fist can't fit back out through the bottleneck. Its open hand can go in there, but once it's grabbing what it wants, the fist can't fit back out. And it will stay there pulling and becoming more and more anxious. And they call it a monkey trap, but it's not really a trap because all the monkey has to do to become free is let go. Similarly, human beings can't just let go of things. And they feel as though I should have had it the way I wanted, or my parents should have done something differently, or this should have worked out, or this should have never failed. And we live in the past with that. We hold on to things. We don't let things go. And it builds resentment. It builds bitterness. It builds self-loathing and self-doubt. And we have to learn how to let go of things so that we can once again live fully in the present moment and move positively forward in our life. And in the case of people recovering from childhood traumas, it's really about teaching them how to survive their childhood in adulthood. How to let go of some of those narratives that they've built their life around based on painful or abusive experiences or adverse experiences. So we'll conclude here, and we'll finish with a mindful meditation, but maybe I ought to open it up to questions now, and then we can do the meditation. So does anybody have any questions about anything I've talked about so far? Yeah.
Is there anything more to the gratitude journal than just recalling 3 positive experiences in the last 24 hours and just writing a little blurb about it?
Yeah, thank you. So the question is there anything more to the gratitude journal other than the 3 positive experiences and writing a blurb about it? So if you do that for 1 week, 3 positive experiences each day, it's best to do it in the evening so the whole day can unfold, and it's one of the last things you think about. So when people do this at the end of the day, they fall asleep faster and they stay asleep longer. The interval between their first time waking up through the night significantly increases in studies of this. Why? Because we usually think about worries before we go to sleep, which is not intentional. I don't think people go, I finished everything, got my pajamas on, I'm ready to go worry. But we do it. And so by practicing this, we actually get better at doing the opposite. And it teaches the brain, or it shows the brain, we're safe. One of the reasons people get insomnia with worries is because the brain interprets it as danger in the environment. If we're worried, maybe there's a predator. That's the legacy of our anxiety. And so we can stay up for the whole night then. It would be like one of our ancestors leaning against a tree and they're keeping watch that night. The other people can sleep and that person's sitting there with a spear keeping watch. When we worry, we tap into that legacy. So by doing this for 1 week, people sleep better, they start thinking more positively, and even if they stop after 1 week, the psychologists have found that on average, at the end of that week, in psychological assessments, people report on average being 1% happier. That's not a big shift, but if they never do it again and they're reassessed after 30 days, they're 5% happier. After 6 months, they're 9% happier. And their life satisfaction goes on increasing indefinitely because after 1 week of sincere practice without missing a day, the brain actually starts to rewire. And it has to be written down because when you think of this, you're using your memory. But if you only think of what you're grateful for, it can easily get lost. If you think about it and you write about it, you have to use your motor cortex to communicate with your memory. And after it comes onto the page and you see it with your occipital lobe, you've now created a symphony of gratitude in the brain. And by doing that every day for a week, those pathways get worn enough where there's now a highway there, and it becomes more natural and more spontaneous. Thank you. Another technique for our students, especially with school avoidance and school anxiety, is to try to help them get into a habit of doing random acts of kindness. Experiments have shown if students can do 6 random acts of kindness a week for 1 month, it will significantly mitigate social anxiety. Probably because when you go outside of your comfort zone in a safe way like that, it builds confidence. Also, acts of kindness release oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone, which makes people want to connect and be around others. So it's a powerful shift that can happen, especially when other interventions seem to be failing. Yes?
On the gratitude journal thing again, you had mentioned some questions to ask in order to make it more specific. I know one of them was how to help your day.
Yeah.
What were some of those other questions?
So what are the questions to help with the gratitude journal? What happened? Why was it meaningful? How was it helpful? How did I feel? Anything like that. There's kind of who, what, when, where, why stuff. And it doesn't have to be long, just be like a sentence or 2 about answering those. Gratitude comes from the Latin word gratia, which meant anything that comes to a person unmerited. So this is the key to finding. That's why people say grace in other languages, because that's what grace means. Grace means the favor of the divine or higher power. And when you appreciate that, these kind of changes happen in the brain. But that's how to find it. Like if I'm enjoying a sunset, that could be an entry for my journal because I didn't buy the sunset. It doesn't matter if I have money or don't have money. It doesn't matter if I've done well today or not. If the sunset's beautiful, I have the opportunity to enjoy it. If a bird is singing and I can take a moment to appreciate it. If someone does something kind for me, helps me in any way, beyond what I've bargained for, it's an opportunity for gratitude. Gratitude practice is a type of mindful awareness. It stimulates a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which regulates digestion. So when people do this before they eat, sincerely, not just mechanically, they get a boost to the brain to help regulate digestion, and it actually improves the ability to break down food and assimilate nutrients into the body. But those are the basic questions to help us. Yeah.
Todd, you talked about trying to do 30 minutes meditation for 8 weeks to become more mindful. I'm just thinking for younger kids, do you try to work up to 30 minutes? Can you do it in 10 minutes? Or?
Thank you. His question is, do you work up to something like 30 minutes? Absolutely. One of the things I see deterring people all the time is the same reason why the gyms and fitness centers are packed in January, but they're back to normal in February. Because people do not make incremental adjustments. They take on more than they have present motivation to do. So when we're trying to make changes in life, scientists have already identified that tiny habits are the best strategy for sustaining change. To take on more than we have present motivation to do will only result in us thinking we can't do it, because we'll inevitably fall short of it, even though we could easily build up to it. So yes, when I'm teaching students and adults, I always start with 1 minute of mindfulness. And we'll do a few minutes after our question and answer session, but you can take that and build over time, slowly. We want to try to keep it where mindfulness meditation feels like a luxury, not something like, oh crap, I still got my half-hour meditation to do. If we start with 1 minute, even if the whole day goes by and you never think about sitting silently watching your breath, and you realize you forgot, you still have time. And there's no pressure. Okay, I'll just sit on the edge of my bed for 1 minute and then I'll go to bed. And after you do that enough, 2 minutes will be easy, 3 minutes will be easy, and there never needs to be this forcing ourselves to do something. Mindfulness, this kind of formal practice, is really a luxury. It's sort of like taking a hot shower or a hot bath. You don't have to really challenge somebody to stay in longer if they had the opportunity to. And ultimately it'll become like that. Because if we don't do more than we can, it'll always feel pretty good. And it's like hygiene also in the sense that it's not something to be good at. Westerners were always worried about this in the beginning when learning about things like meditation, because we're so used to comparing and ranking and being good or bad at stuff. So people are always saying, am I any good at this? Am I any good at this? Could I be good at this? And it was very confusing to teachers from the East because it's just a different way of thinking about life. But we don't think about that with hygiene. We don't wonder, am I as good as my neighbor at brushing my teeth? How good could I get at showering? And when do you use hygiene? You do it as a part of a normal routine, but you might do a little more if, two things, if you were just working out, or if you were gardening and you're really dirty, or if you couldn't get to it for a couple days, then you probably feel like if you're traveling or you're flying, then you know, I think I need to take a really long shower when I get home. Or if you simply have time. When people have time, they may want to just take a bubble bath, light some candles, and relax for a while. It's the same with meditation. Have your basic type of way of doing it. If you're enjoying it and you have time, you can do more. If you haven't been able to do it for a while and you have a lot going on, then you should do it. There's a saying that if you have time, meditate for 15 minutes, and if you don't have time, meditate for 30 minutes. Meaning you're too busy. You got to slow things down. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you speak any to the competing effects of cortisol versus oxytocin, which is what we are dealing with on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, so he asked the question about the competing effects of the hormones cortisol and oxytocin. So cortisol is the stress hormone number one. That's what's creating and contributing to heart disease. When we have anxiety, two primary chemicals are released, adrenaline and cortisol, that come out of the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands sit above the kidneys, which is why the first place you feel fear is in your core. The first place people are going to get butterflies having to do something like I'm doing is in their stomach, because those hormones are starting to be released, creating this swirl of energy. And oxytocin is a different kind of hormone. It's a bonding chemical that comes through affection, kindness, sexual activity, and it brings people together. And interestingly, these neurochemicals and hormones have so many functions that it's really hard to know how to regulate them. So, for instance, you may have heard of the cultural admonition, don't go out in the rain, you'll catch a cold. Anybody ever heard that? From parents or grandma or grandpa? Is it true? Well, if we believe it, something's going to happen if you ever find yourself in that situation. Like if I get a flat tire in the rain and I have to go change it, my body is going to release cortisol because of my belief that the rain will give me a cold, which means there's a threat to my safety and well-being. Anytime there's a threat to your safety and well-being, cortisol gets released. So we know what adrenaline does, right? It gives us a surge of energy to run faster, to get the heck out of there if there's a predator chasing us. What does cortisol do? Cortisol, among other things, suppresses systems. The cortisol sends a signal to suppress the immune system, to suppress digestion. Why? Well, if a predator was really chasing me, what's the point in digesting food? What's the point in fighting bacteria at that time? If you could be faster and stronger by accessing energy out of immunity, you might as well. And that is partly how people are able to do remarkable things when they're in crisis, because all the other systems shut down and people have access to more energy. But in the case of immunity, when I see the rain as a threat to my safety, cortisol is released, suppresses my immune system, and I get infected by germs I would ordinarily be able to defend against, reinforcing the belief, yeah, if you go out in the rain, you'll catch a cold. And so that's just how a few of those chemicals work. Oxytocin is like an opiate, and the more we experience it, the better we feel and the more we want to connect with each other. Mindfulness helps to grow parts of the brain that make us more compassionate, which makes us motivated to be kind. And when we're kind, we get oxytocin, which makes us happier and more motivated to care for each other.
But in our daily work life, the competing event is that in order to be productive, which is what we are, cultured to operate with, we have to have cortisol in order to, put out more and become more effective as a producing agent. So we're working against the other parts of the body, which says back off, allow oxytocin to come in and prevail. So it seems like some parts of the day we have to recognize, okay, we're working at this plateau. Other parts of the day working at another plateau.
I don't know if I understand the question well enough to say, because I have limitations in my knowledge about biology, but I do think that we have to balance all these experiences. So that's why it's important to exercise. Exercising burns up the cortisol that built up in our bloodstream throughout the day, facing the productivity challenges that we face. Meditation helps to reset the system, serves as a buffer between the challenges of the day, and to be able to be as effective as we can in these different roles throughout our day, I do think will bring a healthy balance to our life. Thank you. Maybe one more? Thanks.
We talked about the intentionality of the mindfulness and talking about the core values. You say you need to take an inventory to really determine what is that inventory? How do you do that?
Okay, it's a great question. How do you do the inventory with values? If you can get a long list of values somewhere, I think if you do a search for values, there's different websites. They'll give a long list. I could also email you a list. And all you have to do is circle everything that sounds good to you. So this will take a little bit of time. Circle everything that looks good. You can also get values cards from Amazon. And if you get a stack of cards, you just flip them over and make 2 piles. Yes and maybe. Yes, this is a good value for me. Maybe this is a good value for me. Then you come back until you get it down to like 5 or 10. And when you're down to that many, it means you're going to have to think about, if you could only do this or that, what will you choose? If I could only meditate or only read books, what will I do? If I pick meditation, then I know maybe like inner peace or self-knowledge is more important than education for me. If I know that I would never want to be away from my family, family or loyalty or friendship might be a little higher than independence or freedom. And once I have them prioritized, you can easily set your goals for the new year and you can make decisions. Like, I've had these 3 core values for the year: love, creativity, and adventure. It informs my decisions. I don't put off this trip to Indonesia that's coming up, because with creativity and adventure being my core values, how can I say, well, better to wait and save? Then I might as well put that as a higher value. So it actually helps you to make decisions. And when people can stay consistent with it, you find that you get better results out of the most meaningful areas of your life. People often report to me, I just don't feel like I'm getting good results out of these things that matter to me. It's like, because you're not living as if they really matter to you. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well, yes, is there something you wanted to share? We'll conclude with a few minutes of meditation, and then in the back of the room, I have an email list. I teach mindfulness classes. I have a free monthly class in Plainfield, at Edward in Plainfield. And I do events in the area. I have a podcast. So I have a business card with all my contact info and the podcast on there. It's called Kind Mind. My website's also on the sheet. And feel free to reach out to me anytime if I can be helpful, or for your organizations. And I'm grateful that we could connect today. So if you would set your things down and sit straight. We're going to take a moment to mindfully tune into our body. We're going to ground with our awareness. I'd like you to just pay attention to the sensation of sitting in a chair. So this means just bring your attention to the feeling of pressure as your body makes contact with the chair. And also do that with the floor. Notice how your feet are touching the floor and are supported by the floor. You may allow your feet to sort of sink in a little bit more to the floor. And I'd like you to notice the different places where we store tension as human beings. So if your tongue is pressed against the roof of your mouth, please relax it. And also relax your jaw if your jaw is tight or your teeth are clenched. Try to loosen the jaw in your mouth. Please bring your shoulders further away from your ears and let gravity pull your arms as if they were heavy curtains. Notice any tightness in your stomach, and as you breathe in and out, try to feel as though you're releasing some of the tightness or tension there. Bring your awareness to your hands. And if they're making a fist, gently relax them and find a comfortable place for your hands. And now we'll practice a minute or so of mindfulness meditation on our breath. Without trying to change your breath, just bring more and more awareness to the process of breathing. So like we did with our hand, I will guide you how to pay attention. I'd like you to notice how your breath begins and how it rises within you and how it goes back out and dissipates. And see if you can follow that full cycle. Try to notice how your body expands and contracts, however it naturally does. So we're not forcing anything to be different, we're just paying deeper attention to what is actually happening. Notice the sensation of air flowing in and out of your nose or mouth. Next, try to listen to the sound of breathing, which will be easier when you practice in your quiet place and I'm not talking. But you may notice that it sounds kind of like the ocean and has a similar rhythm. Incoming breath is like an incoming wave. An outgoing breath is like an outgoing wave. If you know how relaxing it can be to be at the beach and to listen to that sound and that pattern, that rhythm, we can find this within ourselves. And the last part of this is to enjoy breathing. Try to notice that with each inhalation, there's a good feeling of new energy and oxygen. With each exhalation, try to notice that it feels enjoyable to release carbon dioxide, to let go. And think of this practice as the art of not doing. The breath is happening on its own, whether we pay attention or not. By deepening our awareness of what's happening, we don't have to do anything. So think of your breath as a pillow for your mind, where you can truly rest. And if you get distracted, just gently bring your awareness back to the present moment, to the breath. We'll do this silently for a few more moments. And you can gradually bring your awareness back to your body, feeling the contact with the seat, with the floor. Wiggle your toes, slightly move your fingers, and then when you feel ready, you may open your eyes and bring your awareness back to the room. So that's something that doesn't take long. You can practice it wherever you are. You can start with 1 minute, and you can grow it from there. On my website, I'm building a meditation portal. I'm also working on a mindfulness app where there will be lessons and the opportunity to systematically grow a practice. And I hope we can connect again, maybe at one of my classes or events. But I'm very grateful that I got to connect with you today, and I'll be in the back of the room if you'd like to sign my email list and grab a card. So thank you, everybody.